And our plenary speaker, as you have discovered one way or the other, is in fact one of our fellows, Professor Wolfgang Mieder. Great things come in small packages. It's either a promise or a threat, I'm not sure. I can't think of any folklore colleague more beloved than Wolfgang Mieder. Or more modest, or more generous with ideas and encouragement. We know that the words Mieder and Proverbs go together like hand in glove. Once upon a time, by the way, in planning this introduction, I thought I would try to sprinkle as many Proverbs as possible and then give a prize at the end for the person who got the count right, like jelly beans in a jar, but I gave that up. We know that the words Mieder and Proverbs go together like hand in glove. The word perenniologist, did I say that right? Perenniologist? Did I say that right? It's the last time you hear me say it. The word that word, does not trip lightly off our tongues, and I wonder if he lists that. One of the things I wondered was in that little tiny space they give us on the 1040 form reporting our taxes, whether that's what he writes in that occupation line. But that's what he is. I mean, he's our best one. Professor Mieder was not born collecting proverbs, at least I don't think so, but the hand that rocks the cradle. Born and raised in Germany, he came to the United States at age 16. He earned his bachelor's degree in French and German, summa cum laude at Olivet College in Michigan, his MA at the University of Michigan, and his PhD in 1970 at Michigan State University. His dissertation topic cemented his love of the study of Proverbs, and after years teaching at Murray State University in Kentucky, he settled in as a professor of German at the University of Vermont, where he still writes and teaches to this day. Professor Mieder's curriculum vitae would humble even the most productive scholars among us. He has been the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 192 books. And that was as of 10 a.m. this morning. I don't know not sure what the count is right now, but. And among these are must-read works in folklore, including Proverbs Are Never Out of Season, Popular Wisdom in the Modern Age in 93, The Politics of Proverbs, From Traditional Wisdom to Proverbial Stereotypes, also in 93. Proverbs Are the Best Policy, Folk Wisdom in American Politics in 2005. And Proverbs Speak Louder Than Words, Folk Wisdom in Art, Culture, Folklore, History, Literature, and Mass Media, 2008. For several years, he's been the editor of Proverbium, the Yearbook of International Scholarship, and the word international in that title reminds us that his reputation is indeed international. He's published 434 articles, book chapters, and encyclopedia entries. Again, as of 10 a.m. this morning. I cannot vouch for the present count, but these numbers are far less important than the quality, scope, and importance of his scholarship. The Festschrifts, I guess it's Festschriften, huh? Assembled in celebration of his 60th and then 65th birthday, testify to the great respect and affection his colleagues hold for him. Now, much of this work, as we see from the titles, is on Proverbs, and I'm not sure where a proverb could ever hide where he would not find it. His archival scholarship is exhaustive and sets a high standard for us all, but he is as comfortable writing about T-shirts and bumper stickers as he is about the use of Proverbs in centuries-old texts. And Proverbs aren't the only genre of folk speech that he helps us to be smarter about. Certainly at any folklore meeting where he's giving a paper, the audience is standing room only. He knows how to deliver an oral performance of a scholarly paper. And the audiences show up because they know that they will hear a learned paper, certainly, but that also they will hear a paper made so enjoyable by his humor and by his infectious love of the material and the ideas, a love that literally, quite literally, bubbles up. If you've watched him give a paper, it bubbles up in his body as he gestures and smiles and takes great delight in making a new connection or announcing a new discovery. In his hands, folklore is fun, sheer fun. But he also knows that folklore is more than fun. He understands very well the ethical importance of folklore scholarship. Proverbs and other genres of folklore can be used for both good and evil, he knows, and in many of his longer essays and books, you can see that ethical sensibility. Recently, I had the occasion to review his newest book, Yes We Can, Barack Obama's Proverbial Rhetoric, and it's a wonderful book, one that I recommend to colleagues in folklore studies, American studies, rhetorical criticism, history, political science, and cultural studies, among others. This book joins a list of Mieder studies on the rhetoric of political figures, from John Adams and Frederick Douglass to Hitler and FDR and Martin Luther King Jr. But Lincoln, Professor Mieder's beloved Lincoln, inspires the study of Obama's use of proverbs in his speeches and writing. Mieder shows us how political leaders use folk speech as powerful tools of persuasion. In Obama's case, Professor Mieder shows how the president's use of proverbs might add commonality and common sense to bring people together. This sensitivity to the ethical dimensions of rhetorical performances, to the ethical and even unethical uses of folk speech genres like proverbs, makes so appropriate the choice of Professor Mieder to deliver this plenary talk at the American Folklore Society meeting, where the conference theme is the ethics of place. So listen to his words, but watch his body language. Watch his excitement and love of his materials, but be careful, he might be contagious.
I don't have to give my speech any longer. Jay just gave it. Well, thank you all for coming, and good morning to you. Thank you all for coming, and good morning to all of you. And I want to thank my fellow folklore fellows for the honor to speak to all of you this morning, especially Jay Mechling and Pat Turner and Simon Brunner, who somehow convinced me, after trying to turn them down at least twice, to do this morning. I really honestly tried to get out of this. But here I am, and now you're stuck with me. I had that wonderful T-shirt out there, look before you leap. I kind of looked hard before I leapt into this morning. But anyway, here I am, in all humility, scared half to death about this address, but hoping that it will go okay. The title of my presentation, then, is It Takes a Village to Change the World, Proverbial Politics and the Ethics of Place. Let me begin with an ancient proverbial expression that contains what the geographer D.W. Meinich has called a personal sense of place. I am referring to the traditional metaphor of standing on the shoulders of giants that places me as a scholar in the intellectual space of great proverb scholars or paremiologists that have become before me and who are no longer with us. From abroad, I might mention Matti Kuusi from Finland, Grigory Vlovich-Permyakov from Russia, Demetrios Loukatos from Greece, and Lutz Röhrig from Germany. And from this country, I would mention Alan Dundes, Per Carnes, Herbert Halpert, Wayland Hand, Archer Taylor, and Bartlett Jerry Whiting. These great folklorists and paremiologists have lent me their shoulders, just as many others have served as your intellectual anchor in the vast sea of scholarship. Let us not forget them as we stake out our own intellectual territory by having learned from them. The ethics of place, in this very narrow sense, should help us in recognizing that we are indebted to scholars of previous generations on whose shoulders we stand and whose names and works we should treasure and perpetuate. Of course, this spatially expressed recognition of great heroes does not hold true solely for folklorists. As President Ronald Reagan reminded us in his first inaugural address of January 20th, 1981, at that time, he said, at the end of this open mall, as you know, in front of the Capitol, are those shrines to the giants on whose shoulders we stand. Directly in front of me, the monument to a monumental man, George Washington, father of our country, a man of humility who came to greatness reluctantly. He led America out of revolutionary victory into infant nationhood. Off to one side, the stately memorial of Thomas Jefferson, The Declaration of Independence flames with his eloquence. And then beyond the reflecting pool, the dignified columns of the Lincoln Memorial. Whoever would understand in his heart the meaning of America will find it in the life of Abraham Lincoln. From standing on the shoulders of American giants, Reagan takes his metaphors to the heart as the place for emotive understanding and onto the nation as a place of national pride. The more subjective identification with the country brings to mind such proverbs as home is home, be it ever so homely, home is where you hang your hat, east or west, home is best, there's no place like home, and of course home is where the heart is. Yet the folk does not only romanticize the house as a warm and comfortable abode, looking at such a structure as a safe haven that protects against unwanted or violent intruders. It has long claimed proverbially, a man's home is his castle. Other proverbs about houses also go well beyond the home as hearth by stressing socio-political issues. A house divided against itself cannot stand. A house that is built on sand will surely fall. If everyone swept in front of his house, the whole town would be clean. And people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. In certain contexts, these proverbs and their metaphors can signify places other than the domicile. To be sure, there are plenty of proverbs referring quite generally to places as such, as for example, there's a time and place for everything, and the well-known, a place for everything and everything in its place. And since a fitting proverb can be found for almost any subject, it should not be surprising that some of them refer to entire nations, as for example, different countries, different customs, my country, right or wrong, a prophet without honor in his own is without honor in his own country, and of course it is a free country. Quite expectedly then, there are also proverbs, finally, looking at the entire world as a global place, to wit, all the world's a stage, it's a small world, one half of the world does not know how the other half lives. A Vermont one, the world is your cow, you have to do the milking. The world is what people make it, and it takes all kinds of people to make a world. Of course, the proverb, every home is a world in itself, describes the integrity of the family home with its customs and traditions, but thousands of such social microcosms make up the global and interconnected macrocosm, as the relatively new proverb, the world is a place, makes clear. Adding some human ethics to this insight, the musical group Rhythm in 1976 came out with the following short lyrics with a proverb introducing the call for a better world. It goes like this: the world is a place for the whole human race to live and relate as brothers. People's eyes are filled with tears and pain. Who's to say your life ain't worth a thing? What can we do to build a house with joy? Spread some love to every girl and boy. It's a place for the human race to live and relate as brothers. A few years earlier, another group of singers, Sly and the Family Stone, I do listen to that type of music, popularized the quintessential American proverb, different strokes for different folks, in their song Everyday People from 1968, emphasizing the same point of all people living together in harmony in this country. We've got to live together. I'm no better and neither are you. We are the same in whatever we do. Love me or hate me, get to know me, and then you can figure out what bag I'm in. I am everyday people. There's a long hair who doesn't like the short hair, for being such a rich one who will not help the poor one. Different strokes for different folks. But just for the record, let us also not forget what Carl Sandburg observed in his long poem, Good Morning America, in 1928. He said, a code arrives, language, lingo, slang. Behold the proverbs of a people, a nation. Even though he speaks about the American people, he thinks of all of humanity exemplified by this nation of immigrants of all ethnicities and nationalities. This is even more apparent in his masterfully scripted epic American poem, The People, Yes, from 1936, replete with literally hundreds of proverbs, proverbial expressions, proverbial comparisons, and other forms of folk speech. It is there where he cites the proverb, it takes all kinds of people to make a world, connecting everyday people in their homes with the world at large, explaining in over 200 pages of phraseological tour de force that basic ethical values tie humanity together. And at no time should there be any place on this earth without ethical underpinnings, as Ben Burroughs has pointed out in his poem Time and Place, 1957, that is based on the proverb, there's a time and place for everything. There's a time and place for everything, so at least they say. Some things occur at nighttime, while still others must have a day. And there are so many places needed for so many things. But there are some things I know of, like kindness and love's embrace, that will live throughout the ages without the need of time and place. Robert David Sack, in his intriguing book, Homo Geographicus, A Framework for Action, Awareness, and Moral Concern, 1997, transposes this poetic interpretation of time and place into the real world by bringing the proverb, a place for everything and everything in its place, into play. And he writes, we are now linked globally. Human actions have affect another person, another culture, and a natural system a continent away. This new level of interrelatedness is a consequence of human activity that we acknowledge by saying we are now participating in a world culture and global system, although we may also wistfully call it a global village, and thereby hope to shrink the process to a single shared local experience. This interconnectedness, he continues, now takes place in innumerable and fragmented units of space. There's virtually a place for everything, and everything is supposed to be in its place. These comments bring to mind that relatively new proverb, think globally, act locally, which has been traced back to the year 1947. By now it has developed into a generally accepted slogan for globalization, but there's also the modern proverb, it takes a village to raise a child, that has become quite popular. It does not appear to be of Nigerian origin, and most likely it is not African at all, even though some parallels, like the Swahili proverb, one hand cannot bring up a child, with the meaning that child upbringing is a communal effort, do exist. It probably is of American coinage, with Toni Morrison maybe, perhaps, being the earliest one, but listen what she said. I don't think one per parent can raise a child. I don't think two parents can raise a child. You really need the whole village. And this was just in an interview, not in one of her major writings. But in this precise wording, it really appeared for the first time in an American newspaper only in 1989. It was popularized by way of Jane Cowan Fletcher's young adult novel, It Takes a Village, 1993, but there's also, of course, Hillary Rodham Clinton's acclaimed book, It Takes a Village and Other Lessons Children Teach Us, from 1996, that helped to spread this wisdom throughout the United States and beyond. In her first chapter, with a truncated proverbial title, It Takes a Village, she includes a revealing explanation of her interest in this particular proverbial text. She writes, children exist in the world as well as in the family. From the moment they are born, they depend on a host of other grown-ups, grandparents, neighbors, teachers, ministers, employers, political leaders, and untold others who touch their lives directly and indirectly. It takes a village to raise a child. In earlier times and places, and until recently in our own culture, the village meant an actual geographic place where individuals and families lived and worked together. For most of us, though, the village doesn't look like that anymore. The horizons of the contemporary village extend well beyond the town line. The village can no longer be defined as a place on the map or a list of people or organizations. But its essence, she says, remains the same. It is the network of values and relationships that support and affect our lives. This being said, the title of this lecture perhaps begins to make sense. Of course, it takes a village to raise a child, but Hillary Clinton very astutely incorporates the village with its familial and social structures, traditions, and values as a small place into the nation as a whole, and beyond that, into the world. After all, the child of today is a citizen not only of a particular country, but of the entire interconnected world. The ethical values with which any child grows up are and should be informed not only from the home, but also from the ethics that govern the globe. The anti-proverb, then, "It takes a village to change the world," formulated by me as my title to reflect on the proverbial rhetoric that takes us from the local and national sphere to global considerations, might just express in a formulaic way how humanity can get from local or national actions based on solid ethics to thinking and, better yet, behaving globally in a responsible fashion in a world committed to the safeguarding of the environment, human rights, and world peace. I think that's a German sentence, right? A bit long. When I was a school kid, I practiced writing long sentences. But is all of this really that new when we look at the history of the socio-political endeavors of a country like the United States and its ethics of place? Folklorist Henry Glassy concludes a chapter on the idea of place in his seminal study of the small Ulster community of Ballymenown with the insightful observation that, inescapably inscribed in the land, history is intrinsic to the idea of place that forces people to be human. Yet what is true for a small place in Ireland can also be observed on a larger scale by an historical glance at the solid commitment by major American socio-political figures to the idea of ethics of place that goes beyond the local and encompasses all of humanity throughout the world with a global or universal view of morality. Much has in fact been made of the idea of ethics of place lately, linking history, geography, ecology, humanity, and ethics into a holistic understanding of modernity. As Cheng-Ji Tang put it in his study on the geographic imagination of modernity, 2008, the moment society came to deem historicity to be a fundamental mode of being in the world, it also realized that to be in the world necessarily meant to inhabit the earth, and that geographic space was every bit as constitutive of human existence as historical time. Modernity, he says, therefore, has an intrinsic spatial dimension with a multitude of cultural and traditional landscapes and an understanding, as the American studies scholar Yi-Fu Chuan has put it in one of his many studies on modern society, that the sphere of moral concern is enlarged so that it now embraces the whole world. In his significant investigation of space and place, The Perspective of Experience, 1997, he reminds us that there are three fundamental places that in various degrees define human existence in space. He says place exists at different scales. At one extreme, a favorite armchair is a place. The other extreme, the whole earth. Homeland is an important type of place at the medium scale. Going on then, what is needed, I would say, is that the rootedness in one's home country does not become the beginning and end of all existence, but that personal and national concerns include global issues. Or, as Anna Peterson expresses in her anthropological study, Being Human, Ethics, Environment, and Our Place in the World, 2001, the human community is fully embedded in and committed to a particular place, and through that specific relationship to the earth more generally. And finally, Yi Fu Tuan summarizes the multi-layered levels of spatial belonging as home is a house and, in the largest sense, a neighborhood, hometown, country, and ultimately the earth. And what should be of major concern, I would say, is how these complex cultural worlds that have points in common can be brought into ethical harmony. Doubtlessly, a good start would be an adherence to the fundamental ethical principle of the religions and philosophies of the world, that is, the so-called proverbial golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Such altruistic and all-inclusive ethics of being and place could lead from a spatial segmentation on various levels to a more holistic view of our world. The American poet and ecologist Gary Snyder very appropriately entitled a lecture delivered in September of 1992 at a conference on rethinking progress in Leh, India, as, and this is the title, A Village Council of All Beings, Community, Place, and the Awakening of Compassion, arguing that a consequence of our human interdependence should be a social ethic of mutual respect and a commitment to solving conflict as peacefully as possible. And Mick Smith, in his invaluable book, An Ethics of Place, Radical Ecology, Postmodernity, and Social Theory from 2001, speaks of a sensus communis that can be inclusive of all humans and non-humans, arguing convincingly that an ethics of place reconnects moral and physical spaces in such a way as to subvert our present ethical agenda. He understands modernity as a process of metamorphosis, as a transformation, restructuring, and reorganizing of the world according to new principles, interests, and needs. Clearly, then, I would say, what is needed is a global ethics, and it behooves Americans to keep this in mind as American culture, politics, business, and so on are spreading around the globe more than ever before. Albert Borgman has made this argument in his fascinating study on real American ethics, Taking Responsibility for Our Country, 2006. But as with many other studies along this line, he argues primarily from the stance of modernity. I would like to add an historical, folkloric, and yes, paremiological component, that's why I'm here, right, to this by showing by means of a number of contextual references that at least to some extent, this emphasis on a common ethics of responsibility for the world has been a leitmotif among some of the greatest Americans, politicians and social reformers alike, over the past 3 centuries. The world has changed, of course, but the thought of making some of the true ethical treasures of America available throughout the world is nothing new. The Bible proverb, "There's nothing new under the sun," still holds much truth when it comes to such matters as the Golden Rule, for example, as a universal guide for humankind in this complex world. Let us then take a look at what some of the greats of this country have had to say proverbially about about that wisdom that the world is a place has to say. And not to give politicians the first word, because I started with Reagan, didn't I? Why not let that universalist and transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson set the tone for the following historical and proverbial comments on an ethics that moves from the local to the global. In a sermon of October 18, 1829, he asked his listeners to consider how much practical wisdom passes current in the world in the shape of Proverbs. These little maxims of worldly prudence are part of the inheritance that have come down to this age from all past generations of men. They have given us their institutions, their inventions, their books, and by means of conversation have transmitted their commentary upon all parts of life in these proverbs. Not a bad definition of a proverb. And to prove his point that proverbs are current throughout the world as expressions of common experience of humankind, Emerson included small collections of them, many in foreign languages, in his journals. But what Emerson sees in Proverbs on the world scale, he also observes locally in a journal entry of August 2nd, 1857, as he describes his visit at Flint's Pond. It's wonderful. Here's what he says. The pond was in its summer glory, the chestnuts in flower, 2 fishermen in a boat, thunder tops in the sky, and the whole picture a study of all the secrets of landscape. A place for everything and everything in its place, no waste and no wear, each minds his own, and none overdo and none interfere. These and the like rules of good housekeeping are kept here in nature. Always the pragmatist philosopher, Emerson in his essay on Montaigne, or The Skeptic, 1850, even moves from a well-known Anglo-American animal proverb onto the world of humankind by way of a fascinating anti-proverb that calls for solid work ethics here and everywhere. He writes, "Let us have a robust life. Let us know what we know, for certain. What we have, let it be solid and reasonable, and our own. A world in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. Let us have to do with real men and women and not with skipping ghosts." Linda, your ghost stories this morning, right? This passage is somewhat reminiscent, I would say, of the sentiments that Abigail Adams expressed 80 years earlier in a letter of May 1st, 1780, to her husband, John Adams, who spent years of governmental service in France and England prior to becoming, as you know, the 2nd President of the United States. Hoping to get John to come home, she wrote proverbially, "I have a castle in the air which I shall write to you upon by the next opportunity, either for you to laugh at and reject or to think of it practicable." This imaginary proverbial castle in the air place actually was an indirect reference to a haven in Vermont, where the couple could retire from the politics of Massachusetts and the federal government, to wit her letter of December 9, 1781. "2 years, my dearest friend, have passed since you left your native land. Will you return ever the close of another year? I will purchase you a retreat in the woods of Vermont and retire with you from the vexations, toils, and hazards of public life. Do you not sometimes sigh for such a seclusion, public peace, and domestic happiness, and write proverb books?" And sure enough, this strong, just wanting to see if you're paying attention, and sure enough, this strong lady, any time the intellectual equal of some of the famous founding fathers of this nation, purchased the land, writing to her husband on July 18, 1782, "My favorite Vermont is a delightful country. I cannot tell why, but I feel a great fondness for the prosperity of that state. I recollected the old adage, nothing venture, nothing have, and by God, I paid for the land." She didn't say by God. "And I paid for the land." The use of the folk proverb was indeed a shrewd way for Abigail to justify her purchase to John, who was, however, not interested in early retirement from national and world politics. And they didn't go, because John wanted and needed to be in the public sector. In fact, they were both early public servants par excellence, and their commitment to making a success of the young United States kept them from secluding themselves in quiet Vermont, that remained a mere proverbial castle in the air place after all. John and Abigail Adams certainly represent an early example of an American lifestyle rooted in the landscape of a small town in Massachusetts, but also embracing the nation and the world with an ethical commitment to making it a better place for all humanity. In fact, in a letter of March 13, 1813, the old John Adams summarizes human life with all humility as being like a bubble, most likely thinking of the ancient Latin proverb, homo bulla, man, a bubble. My two granddaughters, he writes, fill the air of the room with their soap bubbles, their air balloons, which roll and shine, reflecting the light of the fire and candles. And they are so beautiful. There can be no more perfect emblem of the physical and political and theological scenes of human life. Morality only is eternal. All the rest is a balloon and bubble from the cradle to the grave. By adding the spatial proverbial expression from the cradle to the grave to this paragraph, John Adams reduces the human life to two extremely small places, symbolically standing for the beginning and the end of life. And yet, it is in between these two places that all human beings must find their place, reminding us of William Shakespeare's proverbial lines in his As You Like It, and you all know it, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. This concept of the world as place for all humanity has preoccupied American presidents and other major public figures ever since, with Abraham Lincoln helping to transform the Bible proverb, and if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand, Gospel of Mark, chapter 3:25, into the folk proverb, a house divided against itself cannot stand, with his famous house divided speech of June 16, 1858. Here's what he said: "Slavery will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all of one thing or all the other." This speech, of course, is still a far cry from the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863. But Lincoln's use of the house metaphor to stand for the nation as such was a definite stroke of genius. It symbolized not only the division over slavery within the Union, but in a narrower sense also the rift that this issue caused in the homes of families. The proverb thus encompasses all local places as well as the entire country, clearly stating that slavery was tearing apart the moral fibers of the young nation. But let us also look at the end of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address of November 19, 1863, with its proverbial and triadic definition of democracy. This is known to all of you. The world will little know, but notice, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here. But we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Of course, not only Americans, but also citizens of the world did take note of these remarks, delivered with sincere humility. With Gary Wills having provided a detailed study entitled Lincoln at Gettysburg, The Words That Remade America, 1992. However, he says nothing in his rhetorical analysis about Lincoln's use of the words world and earth at the end of the speech. And yet, it would be my conjecture that Lincoln was at least metaphorically placing the tragic conflict over freedom for all inhabitants of the American landscape into the realm of humankind on earth, as we will see in a moment Martin Luther King does later on. Frederick Douglass, former slave and then major abolitionist and also friend of Abraham Lincoln, also incorporated the government-people triad into a global vision in an address of May 30th in 1882 in his hometown of Rochester, New York, indicating that he went in a way far beyond the purely American interpretation of its wisdom. Actually goes beyond Lincoln. Wonderful. The suppression of our rebellion, the rebellion by the South, by force, was not only a thing right and proper in itself, but an immense and immeasurable gain to our country, now notice, our country and the world. Had that rebellion succeeded with all of its malign purposes, what then would have become of our grand example of free institutions? Of what value then would have been our government of the people, by the people, and for the people? What ray of light would have been left above the horizon to kindle the first hope for the toiling millions in Europe? Every despot in the old world would have seen in our manifest instability of government a new and powerful argument in favor of despotic power. God, that man never went to school. Douglass, this champion for freedom and human rights, summarized his struggle for progress in the country and elsewhere in the final version of his autobiography, Life and Times, 1893, with a Bible proverb that expresses a worldview for humankind based on interconnectedness and interdependence. He writes, "No man liveth unto himself," and then he goes on, "or ought to live unto himself. My life has conformed to this Bible saying, for more than most men, I have been the thin edge of the wedge to open for my people a way in many directions and places never before occupied by them. It has been mine, in some degree, to stand as their defense in moral battle against the shafts of detraction, calumny, and persecution, and to labor in removing and overcoming those obstacles which, in the shape of erroneous ideas and customs, have blocked the way to their progress." By extending the proverb, "No man liveth unto himself," from a statement of fact into an imperative, or ought to live unto himself, he points to a moral obligation of humankind to improve the lot of others. Employing numerous proverbs in his powerful rhetoric, he dedicated his life to this effort, especially in his work for African Americans and women. Summarizing his efforts in a speech of August 3rd, 1857, with his formulation of, "If there's no struggle, there is no progress," that might well or ought to become a proverb as "no struggle, no progress." Two of his closest friends, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, traveled throughout the country as well as Europe, thus gaining a vision for equality of women not only in the United States, but in the entire world. Once again, a more or less local and then national effort eventually encompasses the world at large, showing clearly that there must be no borders when it comes to the engaged struggle for freedom and equality. On March 26, 1888, Elizabeth Cady Stanton delivered her address of welcome to the International Council of Women at Washington, D.C. She's good. Watch this. "Here, under the shadow of the capital of this great nation, whose dome is crowned with the goddess of liberty, the women from many lands have assembled at last to claim their rightful place as equal factors in the great movements of the 19th century. So we bid our distinguished guests welcome to our democracy. I hope they will be able to stay long enough to take a bird's eye view of our government of the people. Now it comes. In the old world, they have a government and people. Here we have a government of the people, by the people, for the people." Now I assume she made a little break here, and then she said, "That is, we soon shall have when the We soon shall have, when that important half called women are enfranchised and the laboring masses know how to use the power they possess. This is most certainly effective rhetoric, quoting the government of the people proverb reminiscent of Lincoln and Douglas in a positive way, and then adding an unexpected ironic twist to it that places it right in the middle of women's rights and the whole problem of voting by women and the masses in general. And as Stanton addresses women from many lands, she quite consciously also employs, as you notice, the proverbial phrase to claim one's place, that in this case does not deal with a spatial, but rather with a social position, with the ethics involved in finding an equal place for women in socio-political issues being discussed later on in her speech. And her friend Susan B. Anthony also understood, of course, her energetic work for women's equality and voting rights as not only being an American matter, coming up with a proverb-like motto, I had to look up this word, give women the ballot for fulcrum, right? And she will move the moral world, in a speech on moral purity on April 12, 1879 at St. Louis. Obviously, she is alluding to Archimedes' boast, give me a place to stand on and I will move the world. But while the Greek is speaking of the physical world, the American is concerned with the ethics on that very globe. President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, contemporary of both Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, certainly shared the view of the two grand old ladies that the United States cannot be an island in itself in the world. In a speech in 1905, he makes this quite clear, adding an allusion to the proverb, deeds not words, to his arguments for America being a responsible player on the international scene. He said, much has been given us, and much will rightfully be expected from us. We have duties to others and duties to ourselves. We can shirk neither. We have become a great nation. Interesting how he says this. We have become a great nation forced by the fact of its greatness into relations with other nations of the earth, and we must behave as beseems a people with such responsibilities. Towards all other nations, large and small, our attitude must be one of cordial and sincere friendship. We must show not only in our words but in our deeds that we are earnestly desirous of securing their goodwill by acting towards them in a spirit of just and generous recognition of all their rights. What a statement, in a way, arguing that the United States has been forced into a central place in the world because of its ethical commitment to basic rights for all people. The ideals of this country, put forth in such magnificent documents as the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, that were created at a time when the United States consisted of but small communities, should be a moral beacon for its interrelationship with other nations of the world. And, as Roosevelt is quick to point out, this responsible role must consist only of words but of deeds, as the proverb allusion makes perfectly clear. Now, while it is truly remarkable, I think, that America's earlier public figures were apt to move from local and national considerations to more inclusive global commitment to human rights, it is perhaps not surprising that American leaders broaden this vision even further in light of the fact that America has become a dominant world power. As the United States has struggled with this responsibility, and we're not perfect, I don't want you to get that idea, it was fortunate to have had presidents and civic leaders who tried to keep the country on an ethical course in world affairs. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's extremely short fourth inaugural speech, barely a page and a half, of January 20th, 1945, delivered at the height of World War II, is a case in point. With the war hopefully drawing to an end, Roosevelt cited two proverbial expressions and a proverb to remind the American people of the necessity to find peace in the world by being a player on the world scene. Isolation then or after the war was clearly not a choice for a world power like the United States. And he said, "We have learned lessons at fearful cost, and we shall profit from them. We have learned that we cannot live alone at peace, that our own well-being is dependent on the well-being of other nations far away. We have learned that we must live as men, not as ostriches, not as dogs in the manger. We have learned the simple truth, as Emerson said, that the only way to have a friend is to be one. We can gain no lasting peace if we approach it with suspicion and mistrust or with fear. The metaphors of the proverbial expressions to be an ostrich and to be a dog in the manger are perfect to express the two convictions that America cannot afford to turn a blind eye to world events and that it cannot retreat selfishly on its own territory. Local, regional, and national isolation are in Roosevelt's worldview no options, since the United States has a responsible place to fill in the world at large. Being a global partner, the United States should rather be a fair and helpful friend to other nations, as Roosevelt explains by citing the wisdom, "The only way to have a friend is to be one," from Emerson's essay on friendship, 1841, that has long since become a proverb. Harry S. Truman, quite a contrast to the tall and well-educated Roosevelt, took over the presidency after Roosevelt's death, doing his damned, I'm using his word here, doing his damned best to fill his predecessor's shoes and to continue in the footsteps of this giant of world politics. He might have been a little man, lacking a college education, but he sure knew how to give such greats as Joseph Stalin and Winston S. Churchill a bit of hell as they dealt with reshaping the world after the war. Arguing that, here comes Truman, the American people stand firm in the faith which has inspired this nation from the beginning. We believe that all men have a right to equal justice under law and equal opportunity to share the common good. We believe that all men have the right to freedom of thought and expression. We believe that all men are created equal. From this faith, we will not be moved. The American people desire and are determined to work for a world in which all nations and all people are free to govern themselves as they see fit and to achieve a decent and satisfying life. Above all else, our people desire and are determined to work for peace on earth, a just and lasting peace based on a genuine agreement freely arrived at by equals. This noble rhetoric can stand next to that of other great American presidents. And to be sure, Truman meant what he said, to wit the humanitarian Marshall Plan that helped undernourished youngsters like me to get fed. I was but 5 years old at the time. It's going to be a little bit hard. I was but 5 years at the time, but my earliest childhood memories are my mother mixing powdered milk with water, or making scrambled eggs from dried eggs. I practice it, you know. And my father adding a bit of sugar to condensed milk so that I could enjoy something sweet. All of this came from America, including my favorite shoes, jacket, and pants. And then there were those wonderful care packages. Pat, you mentioned them earlier, remember? Care package to Obama. You should have seen my little legs carrying me to the small grocery store at the corner of the street to get one of them when a shipment from America had arrived. A small treasure of peanut butter crackers, candied fruit, chewing gum, which we were not allowed to eat at school and did nevertheless, a candy bar, of course, and many other things. Perhaps this is why I longed to come to America from my childhood on. Well, let's go on to John F. Kennedy. He's very inspiring. As John F. Kennedy struggled to keep this peace at the height of the Cold War, he made the pledge to help people everywhere during his speech from 1961, appropriately replacing the reference to God in the proverb, "God helps those who help themselves," by the pronoun "we," that stands for the United States and its citizens. He says, beautifully put, to those people in the huts and villages across the globe struggling to break the bounds of mass misery, we pledge our best efforts to help them help themselves for whatever period is required, not because the communists may be doing it, not because we seek their votes, but because it is right. If a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich. It is interesting to note how the president takes his moral message to the smallest huts and villages across the globe, obviously wanting to reach people wherever possible with his message of humanitarian aid and the idea of freedom. And when Jimmy Carter took over our government reins on January 20th, 77, he picked up the same theme but added the proverbial phrase of a place in the sun to it. He said, the world itself is now dominated by new spirit. Peoples are more numerous and more politically aware, are craving and now demanding their place in the sun. And not just for the benefit of their physical condition, but for basic human rights. The passion for freedom is on the rise, he said. Tapping this new spirit, there can be no nobler nor more ambitious task for America to undertake than to help shape a just and peaceful world that is truly humane. I don't know if Jimmy knew this, but the phrase, a place in the sun, he might not have wanted to use it, was coined by the German Chancellor Bernhard von Bülow in the Reichstag speech of December 6, 1897, as he explained and tried to justify Germany's colonial ambitions. Von Bülow said, in a word, we desire to throw no one into the shade. Sounds kind of Germanic, doesn't it? In a word, we desire to throw no one into the shade, but we also demand our place in the sun, Platz an der Sonne. Quite typical for Carter, of course, he pushed aside the political and territorial claims of the phrase and employed it as an expression of a place governed by the light of human rights. Now, perhaps Jimmy Carter had the great civil rights champion, Dr. Martin Luther King, in mind as he uttered these words. Be that as it may, this remarkable preacher, intellectual, civil rights leader, Nobel laureate, and martyr in the cause of racial equality and social justice had the rhetorical power and social commitment to fight for human rights for all people in all places. From the smallest hamlet in the deep South to the city of Birmingham, from Alabama to the entire United States, and finally throughout the world. There is no doubt that Martin Luther King embodies the inclusive idea of ethics of place linguistically, intellectually, and socially through word and deed. King's struggle for justice and equality began as a grassroots movement, as we all know, in the Deep South, with cities like Atlanta, Birmingham, Montgomery, and Salem, with our protests and marches for civil rights, having entered the annals of American history forever. But while he obviously started as a champion of justice and equality for African Americans in the region of his activities as a minister, he actually was concerned with larger goals that not only included the entire nation, but the whole world. In a speech on facing the challenge of a new age, delivered in, look at date, I had fun, I read about 1,000 pages of Martin Luther King for this little bit here, these few pages. But anyhow, he declared in this speech of 1956, wow, at Montgomery, he declared that the new world is a world of geographical togetherness. This means that no individual or nation, he says, can live alone. We must all learn to live together or we will be forced to die together. In his book, Stride Toward Freedom, 1958, that served as a handbook of his nonviolent movement, he argued that, quoting him here, in a real sense, the racial crisis in America is part of the larger world crisis. But his commitment to taking a struggle for civil rights beyond the local and national to the international scene is best expressed through this metaphor of, I don't know where he got this, of the world house. It sounds better in German, by the way, Welthaus, for some reason. Anyhow, in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, 1967, listen to this. We have inherited a large house, that we transform this worldwide neighborhood into a worldwide brotherhood. And of course, typical for the moral preacher, King adds an ethical component to his vision of this geographical interconnectedness, saying, "Our hope for creative living in this world house that we have inherited lies in our ability to reestablish the moral ends of our lives in personal character and social justice. Without this spiritual and moral reawakening, we shall destroy ourselves in the misuse of our instruments. The stability of the large world house, which is ours, will involve a revolution of values to accompany the scientific and freedom revolutions engulfing the earth." Clearly, Proverbs are part of the rhetorical style of King, whose sermons, lectures, and books are replete with folk and biblical wisdom. In this, he follows a strong phraseological tradition in African American parlance, taking his listeners and readers to verbal and ethical heights that are moving, if not overwhelming, in their expressive power. This is definitely the case in the following paragraph from a speech about the American Dream, 1961, that he gave at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. This is what he said. "All life is interrelated. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny." Now that's beautiful. "Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. This is the way the world is made. I didn't make it that way, but this is the interrelated structure of reality." Now comes the proverb, of course. John Donne caught it a few centuries ago and could cry out, "No man is an island to himself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main." And he ends, "If we are to realize the American dream, we must cultivate this world perspective." Before concluding these deliberations with a look at, and you know this would come, my friend, if you would only know, at Barack Obama, whose humane ethics of place, there is one more paragraph, I think, from Martin Luther King's book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, that deserves to be cited. Well, there are many more, but now. It is framed by two proverbial expressions. To be in the red is used to express the indebtedness of all people to one another, and to be one's brother's keeper is employed to remind people of the message of the Bible that people should take care of each other. And this ethics, as King makes perfectly clear, is to encompass the earth, or as the modern proverb song has it, which you already heard me cite, the world is a place for the whole human race to live and relate as brothers. Okay, here comes King. "All men are interdependent. Every nation is an heir of a vast treasury of ideas and labor to which both the living and the dead of all nations have contributed. Whether we realize it or not, each of us lives eternally in the red. We are everlasting debtors to known and unknown men and women. In a real sense, all life is interrelated. The agony of the poor impoverishes the rich. The betterment of the poor enriches the rich. We are inevitably our brother's keeper because we are our brother's brother. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." Okay, a world house then, based on ethics of place and a keen recognition of what King calls the inescapable network of mutuality among everyone and everything, is what it is all about, to use a modern turn of phrase. And Barack Obama is well aware, of course, of the ideals expressed by the admired Martin Luther King. Little wonder that he is fond of the proverbial expression to stand on the shoulders of giants, with which he acknowledges the debt he owes, especially to civil rights leaders and many others who helped him occupy the place that we call the White House as the first African American. As he said in a speech on July 14, 2008 at Cincinnati, "It is always humbling to speak before the NAACP. It is a powerful reminder of the debt we all owe to those who marched for us and stood up on our behalf, of the sacrifices that were made for us by those we never knew, and of the giants whose shoulders I stand on here today. It cannot possibly then come as a surprise that Barack Obama also shares his predisposition for the proverbial interrogative, "Am I my brother's keeper?" from the Bible with Martin Luther King. Both used it on numerous occasions, with Obama very consciously expanding the proverb to include women. The following remark from his speech on a more perfect union that we all listened to, I'm sure, delivered on March 18, 2008 at Philadelphia, is particularly telling since it shows in but a few sentences the interconnectedness of the world as a place through the ethics of the Golden Rule. Obama said, "In the end, then, what is called for is nothing more and nothing less than what all the world's great religions demand, that we do unto others as we would have them do unto us. Let us be our brother's keeper," Scripture tells us. Now it comes. "Let us be our sister's keeper. Let us find the common stake that we all have in one another, and let our politics reflect that spirit as well." This short paragraph exemplifies Obama's rhetorical gift that parallels that of the great orator Martin Luther King. It is especially noteworthy that he does add sisters to the brothers to be inclusive, but it is also of great importance that he has changed the phrasing of the Bible text from a question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" to an imperative. In other words, we have a moral obligation to keep each other safe as a fundamental obligation in an interconnected world. When Obama gave his speech on a world that stands as one on July 4th, 2008 at Berlin, he won the hearts and minds of Germans and Europeans alike when he began with a personal comment. "I come to Berlin as so many of my countrymen," thinking of Kennedy, of course, "as so many of my countrymen have come before. Tonight, I speak to you not as a candidate for president, but as a citizen, a proud citizen of the United States and a fellow citizen of the world." And then, reminiscent of tearing down the Berlin Wall almost exactly 20 years ago today, he made the significant point that globalization means tearing down walls and fences of all types throughout the world, saying, "The burdens of global citizenship continue to bind us together. Partnership and cooperation among nations is not a choice. It is the one way, the only way, to protect our common security and advance our common humanity. That is why the greatest danger of all is to allow new walls to divide us from one another. The walls between old allies on either side of the Atlantic cannot stand. The walls between the countries with the most and those with the least cannot stand. The walls between races and tribes, natives and immigrants, Christian and Muslim and Jew cannot stand. These are now the walls we must tear down." This surely is a rhetorical masterpiece with a folkloric three-time repetition of the proverbial formulation, "The wall between ... cannot stand," that will surely have brought to mind Lincoln's use of the Bible proverb that we already quoted, "A house against itself cannot stand." Towards the end of the speech, Obama brings the United States back into focus, reminding his German and European audience that his country remains dedicated to the idea of self-improvement, perfecting the Union as it serves others. "I know that for more than 2 centuries, we Americans have strived, at great cost and great sacrifice, to form a more perfect Union, to seek with other nations a more hopeful world. Every language is spoken in our country. Every culture has left its imprint on ours. Every point of view is expressed in our public squares. What has always united us, what has always driven our people, what drew my father to America's shore, is a set of ideals that speak to aspirations shared by all people, that we can live free from fear and free from want, that we can speak our minds and assemble with whomever we choose and worship as we please." Almost finished. This nation of immigrants, the melting pot or tossed salad of the languages and cultures of the world could well be guideposts for the world. Obama expressed this in his formidable speech on race again when he said, "I believe deeply that we cannot solve the challenges of our time unless we solve them together, unless we perfect our union by understanding that we may have different stories, but we hold common hopes, that we may not look the same and we may not have come from the same place, but we all want to move in the same direction towards a better future for our children and grandchildren." With his usual audacity of hope, epitomized by the proverbial slogan, "Yes, we can," Obama projects a typically American forward-looking vision, as Alan Dundas describes and interprets it in his article, "As the Crow Flies, a straightforward study of lineal worldview in American folk speech." Little wonder that an euphoric Barack Obama, in his victory speech of November 4, 2008 at Chicago, drew on the universal proverb, "All things are possible," claiming its truth factor for himself as the first African American having been elected president, and also for the entire United States. And interesting the word choice here. America is a place where all things are possible. I would say, yes, Obama could simply have said, "In America, all things are possible." But I think he chose to stress America as a unique place. The concept of place in its many ramifications is actually something with which Barack Obama has been quite preoccupied. And I do not mean only even by now, natural question of what his place in history as president will be. It is finding his own place, his identity, as it were, that might well serve as a conclusion of this survey of the use and function of proverbial language in the ethics of place. As Obama reports and reflects on his quest for place, he proves himself to be quite the folklorist and ethnographer. As, for example, when he tells about his early work as a community organizer in Chicago in his celebrated autobiography, Dreams for My Father, for which he most likely quite consciously chose the subtitle, A Story of Race and Inheritance, to stress its narrative character, including a plethora of stories, proverbs, proverbial phrases, and other folkloric references based, I would say, on a considerable amount of field research. He stresses the importance of listening to the personal narratives that people had to tell. It's a nice segment in that book. So he says, stories full of terror and wonder, studded with events that still haunted or inspired them, the people of the South End, sacred stories. As he explains that these stories helped him find his place with the common people of the South End of Chicago, he felt uplifted and part of a larger social network, saying, then they'd offer a story to match or confound mine, a knot to bind our experiences together, a lost father, an adolescent brush with crime, a wandering heart, a moment of simple grace. As time passed, I found that these stories, taken together, helped me to bind my world together, that they gave me a sense of place and purpose I'd been looking for. This certainly qualifies, I would say, as a bit of psychological folklore work, with the phrase to bind one's world together, showing that Obama's sensitive and effective rhetoric is informed by empathy for the place of others, as he is searching himself for the place that gives him a social anchor. Having found this place or identity in a small village in Africa, Obama, the cosmopolitan, who could not possibly return to that setting in earnest, is ready to continue his life struggle in the service of others. Home, village, and country are, and this is actually, he's saying this, no longer a construct of words, those words, but rather places for responsible and engaged action. For Obama, then, it took his African village to change his world. That is not solely a personal matter, might also be gleaned from his final use of a proverb by the intriguing proverbialist Obama that I had not known before reading his moving autobiography. The proverb in question appears in an interchange between Obama and a friend who initiates it on the street in Chicago. I'm making full circle here. I'm telling you, man, the world's a place. Say, the world's a place, huh? That's just what I'm saying. As if to reinforce the message of this proverb describing the world as quite a place where all kinds of things can happen, the friend follows up with an account of a recent suicide of a young white girl who had jumped from a high building. The friend, stamping out his cigarette on the sidewalk, concludes his story in a solid street slang that shows Obama's ability to play the entire register of language, from the sublime to the scatological. I'm sure many of you know. So that's what I'm saying, Barack. Whole panorama of life out there. Crazy shit going on. You've got to ask yourself, is this kind of stuff happening elsewhere? Is there a precedent for all that shit? You ever ask yourself that? The world's a place, I repeated. See there? It's serious, man. Perhaps the proverb, the world is a place, is a modern variant of the traditional wisdom that we know and love from Shakespeare, the world is a stage. That is not so much an anti-proverb, but rather a semantic expansion of the original proverb, from stage to place. It expresses the idea that all kinds of things take place in this world, of which some are beyond our control and comprehension. But that should not be cause for despair. For those stubborn ideas, survival and freedom and hope, as Obama is quick to point out, will persist and make the struggle for change and progress go on. Our global mutuality on all fronts clearly calls for a commitment to the universal concept of ethics of place, from village to nation and on to the world, with the golden rule being a guiding principle. The short proverb, the world is a place, might be too ambiguous in its simplistic message in order to serve as another ethical motto for humanity. But its longer variant, the world is a place for the whole human race, represents, I think, a perfect moral guidepost. Citing the first stanza of the song that it comes from once again, and also expanding the last line by a significant addition, I think you know what it is, we have a proverb for humanity that encapsulates the concept of an ethics of place that stretches from the individual to all humankind and from the village to the entire world. The world is a place for the whole human race to live and relate as brothers and sisters. Thank you very much.
I hope you were watching his body language as I alerted you to do that. And I hope you got some of that contagious stuff. We were trying to figure out some small but appropriate little remembrance from this event, and thanks to the meticulous research by Simon Bronner, we've decided that as a memory of this subject and place, we have a book here called The Cowboy Ethics, What Wall Street Can Learn from the Code of the West and from Wolfgang Mieder. So, now, we have time and we have microphones, so I'm sure Wolfgang would be willing to respond if people had questions or comments, or if they wanted to why don't you come up here?
thank you for your very kind reaction. I do want to tell you that I'm not absolutely naive. I know that our country isn't perfect, but I wanted to present an uplifting picture today. Oh, Steve, go
I
ahead.
have a comment and a question. I think it's wonderful that Wolfgang still gets a little nervous when he speaks to the society, but they tell me that after your 200th book, you start to feel a little more confident, so you don't have too far to go. And my question is, I wonder if there was kind of a proverbial flap in the news last week, which we heard a lot about, I think, on Capitol Hill. I'm not sure everyone else did. But two county chairmen of the Republican Party in South Carolina wrote a letter to the editor praising Jim DeMint, their senator, in which they used the proverb, take care of the pennies and the dollars will take care of themselves. But the way they used it was, their exact wording, I think, was, there's a saying that the Jews who are wealthy got that way not by watching dollars, but by taking care of the pennies and the dollars taking care of themselves. And this caused a reaction in which the senator himself apologized for the remark, and the two people eventually apologized for it as well. But I wonder, thinking about the ethics of place and of the fact that in some places in the country, a mistake like that would be less likely to be spoken, and other places perhaps more likely, and the question of the Jewish people as a people historically displaced, whether there's anything that this brings up for you in terms of the ethics of place and proverbial speech.
Well, thank you, Steve. As you well know, the thing that comes to my mind, and I don't want to quote my papers, but some of you remember I once did a paper on the only good Indian is a dead Indian, and also on no tiki, no washi, and then I did a book on to call a spade a spade. I mean, this is, of course, the problem, I think, not just with Proverbs, but also with folklore in general. Depending on what context and so on, folklore can be misused, and there are, of course, stereotypical proverbs that, it behooves us not to use them, or to point out to people when they do use them that is not appropriate. But I think that's really all that I can say, Steve. I appreciate your comment. The study that I once made of to call a spade, which fits maybe the best to what we talked about today, you have a phrase there that goes all the way back to classical times, and it really, honestly, means nothing else but to call a garden tool a garden tool. But because of the development of the playing cards and having the suit of spades, and that suit happening to be black, to call a spade has that black orientation. And then, of course, I remember when I came to Detroit, when I arrived in 1960 in Detroit, I learned the word spade as a slur towards African Americans, unfortunately, very quickly. But in America then, there was a little issue in the press just the other day on that too, Steve. That's why I'm bringing it up. In America, and that's the way I concluded my book. I think in America, because so many people interpret the spade as being a slur against African Americans, it has become a slur. However, if you live in Australia or you use British someplace else in the world, be careful to point the finger at someone right away who very innocently uses the phrase to call a spade by just meaning to say, I want to tell you the way it is, right? But in this country, it has become a slur. But I had quite a time with that project. I done field research at Berkeley, at Morehouse College, at my own university, and I'm happy to admit the University of Vermont students were predominantly the ones who felt it was a racial slur. And Morehouse students were the lowest also interesting. You know. But, well, I don't know. I don't think I'm answering your question, Steve. I'm not quite getting my handle on it. But I think maybe just to wind it up, the Proverbs are not simplistic little things. You know, there are many anti-Semitic slurs. There are anti-German proverbs, you know, and so on. Remember that famous book by Abraham Robach, Dictionary of International Slurs, 1944. It's full, and it's like jokes, ethnic jokes. The structures are the same, and the proverbial structures are transferable from one ethnic group, nationality to the other.
Hi. I'm wondering if you could comment on the role of the speechwriter in generating these political proverbs.
Excuse me?
You know, a lot of these political proverbs I mean, Obama uses a speechwriter.
Yeah,
you
now he
know,
does.
Kennedy used a speechwriter.
Yeah,
Carter used a
yeah,
speechwriter.
yeah.
So could you maybe just talk
Yeah,
about the artist generating the proverb might not be the political figure.
You are right. There is a long scholarship history on what really is the authenticity of American presidents' speeches. And we know for a fact that already George Washington got help for his. Supposedly, James Garfield is the only president who never, ever used a speechwriter. With Obama, you are right. Yes, he started to use speechwriters, but we're a little bit fortunate with Obama because of his two books, and we know that starting to use Jon Favreau, really he came into his own not all that much before, let's say, the actual final election. So we're a little bit lucky there. But all the scholars of presidential speeches argue the following way. And by the way, we know it particularly well from Harry S. Truman. Harry S. Truman already had about 7 or 8 speechwriters. You know, that's quite a team, and it's much larger even now. But anyhow, Truman always made the point, he said, yes, I have a speechwriter who frames basically what I need to say, let's say at Berlin, right? I might even tell him kind of what I want to say. And then that person works on it. But the president, if he or she is really serious about the speeches, certainly has the final word on it. In other words, the final touches. Truman used to say, I look through it, and then Beth looks through it, and then it's going to be okay. Remember that woman upstairs? Well, anyhow, and I think that is also true for Obama now. But I completely understand. Anyhow, so in American scholarship, we take the presidential speeches to be the president's speeches. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And so I've written to Jon Favreau, but he hasn't taken the time to respond to me. And I had the audacity, by the way, of writing President Obama before he gave his inaugural speech, begging him with his rhetorical prowess to please write his own inaugural speech, but I never got a response to that either. I put it in my book on Obama, though. No, I see your point, but we have to deal with it that way, I think. Well, I mean, one more thing. I, of course, observe, let's say with Obama, I, of course, observe him also when he gives spontaneous, not whole speeches, but spontaneous remarks. And I find him to be quite consistent with what I found in all of his speeches. So, long way of saying, I don't think the proverbial language, particularly in the speeches he has been given, are Jon Favreau's. How's that? Thank you.